All right. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see all of you. Welcome to New York Law School. I'm Anthony Crowell, the Dean and President here, and the Faculty Director of our Center for New York City and State Law. Thank you. We are honored to host New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli today as he addresses navigating economic and fiscal uncertainty in New York. As New York's law school, as we call ourselves, for the past 134 years, we have engaged on the key legal and policy matters affecting New York, and we serve as a resource and partner to government and the civic community. That includes the 1/3 of our graduates entering public service and public interest each year, and many enter state government roles. And of course, leading our public service engagement is the Center for New York City and State Law, originally founded over 30 years ago by the Samuel Seabury Professor of Law, Ross Sandler. As our regular attendees know, Ross usually serves as our host and master of ceremonies and introduces our speaker. However, he is on a well-earned sabbatical right now, and he is focusing on writing a book about public corruption and will return this fall. So today, we are joined by one of New York's most critical leaders, Comptroller DiNapoli, who is himself a lifelong public servant and has provided steady leadership for decades. The state comptroller has immense responsibilities, which will become even more critical as New York experiences a number of pressing issues. There is a lot of ground and recent news the comptroller will cover this morning, including the newly passed state budget, the impacts of federal policies, the MTA, and so much more. And we are fortunate to have him here to discuss these matters. So thank you, Comptroller DiNapoli, for speaking with us and for your decades of service to our state. Now, with that, I will hand the program over to Ben Max, our Executive Editor and Program Director, to give a fuller introduction. Ben?
Morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. Good morning. Thank you, Dean Crowell, and thank you all for being here. For those watching the live stream or watching at a later date, the recording of this event. As the Dean mentioned, I'm Ben Max, Program Director here at the Center for New York City and State Law. Very excited about today's program with the Comptroller, who I'll introduce in just a moment. We are bringing you and other civic-minded New Yorkers many good and meaty programs these days, so please continue to join us, along with some great recent guests, including the Commissioner of the Department of Investigation of New York City and the Police Commissioner of New York City. Coming up, we have 3 more events in May and June to let you know about, so mark these down and please do RSVP and join us. On the evening of May 29th, I'll be co-hosting a special 2025 New York City primary election preview night with several other journalists. We're going to give the latest analysis of the mayoral race and other races to watch as we head towards primary day, June 24th. And we'll have some special guests and a lot of audience participation that evening. So if you're interested, please join us. That's going to be at 5:30 p.m. on May 29th, but please do RSVP if you're going to come. And then a couple other morning events coming up in June. On the morning of June 3rd, we're going to host a debate in the Democratic primary for Manhattan Borough President. So please join us the morning of June 3rd. And on June 17th, we'll have our next City Law Breakfast, and our guest speaker will be Congressman Dan Goldman, who represents, of course, New York's 10th Congressional District, including New York Law School. So those are 3 great events coming up, May 29th, June 3rd, and June 17th. Please do RSVP and join us. And if you're particularly interested in the city elections that are unfolding, please do give a listen to the podcast that I host, Max Politics. We're digging in a lot on the election cycle and what it means for New York City as we head towards primary day in June and the general election in the fall. All right, today we are here to hear from New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli for our 198th City Law Breakfast, and we're grateful the Comptroller is here with us today. And it's indicative of our expanded focus here at the Center for New York City and State Law to further incorporate the city-state relationship and examine how New York City and state rely on each other, how so much of what happens at the state level impacts and dictates what happens in the city, and of course, the degree to which the city is so important to the state. Tom DiNapoli is the 54th state comptroller in New York history and has been in the statewide position since 2007. As New York's chief fiscal officer, his responsibilities include protecting taxpayer funds by uncovering waste, fraud, and abuse, providing independent fiscal oversight on state, New York City, and local government finances, managing the state pension fund, administering the state retirement system, reviewing contracts and payments, and much, much more. Comptroller DiNapoli is a lifelong Long Islander and won his first election in 1972 at the age of 18 to become a trustee on the Mineola Board of Education. He went on to earn degrees from Hofstra University and the New School's Graduate School of Management and Urban Professions. In 1986, he won a seat in the New York State Assembly, representing parts of Nassau County for the next 2 decades. Upon an opening in the state comptroller's office midterm, a bipartisan majority of the state legislature elected then Assemblymember DiNapoli as comptroller in February of 2007, and he has since won statewide elections to keep the position in 2010, 2014, 2018, and 2022. With his, it's a good winning streak. With his 18 years and counting in the role, Comptroller DiNapoli is the second longest serving state comptroller in New York history. He's particularly proud of his record as a fair and collaborative and tough state fiscal officer who holds others accountable and puts the best interests of the state and its residents first. He's been a champion for transparency in state government when it comes to state spending and the ways in which the state does and does not get good bang for its buck on things like economic development programs and much more. Under Comptroller DiNapoli, the office, which employs roughly 2,700 accountants, auditors, analysts, economists, and others, has rooted out fraud, waste, and abuse in government around New York, including work leading to the arrests of hundreds of individuals for abusing the public trust. During a tenure that has seen many swings in the market, he's focused on careful stewardship of the roughly $270 billion pension fund, being counted on by well over 1 million current and former state and local employees and other beneficiaries. As he will today, Comptroller DiNapoli regularly provides fact-driven analysis of economic, fiscal, and policy issues, giving insights that no other office offers. And the office's audits have held government accountable and led to significant savings and reforms across state and local governments. Too many to go into, but just recently, a particularly interesting and impactful audit on the state's spending on medical supplies during the pandemic. Comptroller DiNapoli's office has closely monitored New York City government's budget and fiscal health, as well as that of the MTA, 2 topics he will touch on today, as well as the just passed state budget. They didn't give you quite enough time with this state budget. You know, when we booked the comptroller for May 13th, we really thought he would have some time between the state budget passing and when he was coming here, but they didn't give him much time. So he'll have a few thoughts for us today, but the office will really be digging into the new state budget more in the coming weeks, of course. The budget was well over a month late after the April 1st start of the fiscal year, but it comes in at about $254 billion. That includes also a lot of policy making. So please join me in welcoming New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli.
Good morning, everyone. It is great to be here on a beautiful New York City morning, a little cloudy, but at least the weather seems to be getting a bit better. I want to thank your president and Dean Crowell for his warmth in greeting me and giving me a quick update on the great successes here. 14-year tenure, that's pretty good. Keep it going. And applications are up. And can I share with the audience that little factoid you mentioned to me? With the incoming class, women will represent 70% of the incoming class. So that is great, just great. I do want to give a shout out for Ross Sandler. I know he's on sabbatical, as Ben mentioned, but I know he's been such an important part of this program, and really appreciate the over 130-year history of this law school, and appreciate the doing more to engage the larger community in these issues. And certainly, I want to acknowledge Ben Max for his role here at the law school. I said to President and Dean Anthony Crowell that getting Ben Max was a very smart acquisition for New York law. From my perspective over the years, Ben has been one of the more thoughtful journalists out there and understands what's been happening. So I know you're going to add value to the programs here. So Ben, thank you for that generous introduction. Yeah, he deserves a round of applause. You know, Ben really gave a expansive overview of what we do. I'm obviously not going to go into all of that in the interest of time, although you may want to ask questions about some of the areas that Ben mentioned that I may not cover in my remarks. I always get a kick as the years go by when people still mention, because I think it's the little factoid of my life that will be with me forever and beyond, is that I was first elected to public office at age 18 and becoming the first 18-year-old in New York State to be elected to anything. Others have followed, not as many as I would have liked, but I always say I'm the Jackie Robinson of teenage people running for office. But I will say this to Ben, my friend, the next time you introduce me, you're not supposed to say what year it happened. You're just supposed to say, because once you say the year, everybody sits there and goes, starts calculating. They say he's that old, but then they say he looks pretty darn good for that age, as well you should. So navigating the uncertainty with our economy and our finances right now for the city and the state, very, very broad topic. So let me throw a bunch of stuff at you and certainly open it up for your questions. You know, when people ask me, where are we at now, where are we headed, you know, the context, I think, is still very much coming out of the COVID experience. And really the purpose of my remarks today is to give that sense of context as to where we are today. You know, there's no doubt that COVID, obviously from a public health perspective, was a major hit. Thankfully, most of that's in the rearview mirror, not totally, you still got to be careful. But the real impact that we looked at from the Comptroller's Office perspective was the close down of the economy, what that did to government revenues, what it did in terms of job loss. So when we talk about, you know, the context of where we're at today, it really is still a question of recovery. Where are we at with the recovery? So the good news there is that from an employment perspective, the numbers continue to grow in terms of job creation. So the unemployment rate has been, you know, pretty steady around 4.2%, a bit higher in New York City, a bit over 5%. We have grown back all of the 2 million or so jobs that were lost during the depths of the COVID close down. And in fact, we've added jobs. We've added about 130,000 jobs beyond where we were at pre-pandemic level. So that is very, very good news. And I have to say, in recent years, New York City has particularly led the way as far as job recreation. That's been significant because one of the reasons why New York State was lagging the rest of the nation in recovery coming out of the pandemic is that New York City was not recovering as quickly. Now New York City has really been leading the state in terms of recovery. The challenge, though, and I won't get into too much of the specific numbers, but just again to paint the picture, while our statewide numbers are very strong and positive in terms of job creation and where we stand versus pre-pandemic, there's great diversity in the numbers when you break it down by region and by sector of the economy. So again, because New York State is so big and so diverse, I think it's important for us to look at the regional context as well. So 5 boroughs in New York City, Long Island, Lower Hudson Valley, a very, very strong recovery. When you look at areas around Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, Capital Region around Albany, pretty close to where it was pre-pandemic. Some of the numbers vary. Some of them are right there. Some of them are a little below. But you do have some other regions that really have a ways to go to get back to where they were pre-pandemic. The North Country, the Southern Tier, Central New York around the Utica-Rome area. And the same thing as far as sectors of the economy. There's no doubt, no surprise coming out of COVID, healthcare, social assistance, significant job growth in those sectors of the economy. Retail, leisure, hospitality, construction, manufacturing. Again, the numbers vary by region, but those are parts of the economy that still have a ways to go. So we continue to look at those kind of global numbers for the state and drill down on the regional numbers as well, again, to just track what our progress has been. In terms of the New York State budget, as Ben mentioned, it's completed. It was a bit late. There was some betting going on as to whether we would have a state budget or a new pope, who would come first. I think the pope actually came in a little bit ahead of the state budget in terms of final voting. But it was a lengthy process, as it often is. The budget is now $254 billion, the highest level in the state's history. And as you know, the process kicks off with the governor's executive budget, then the legislature and the governor come up with a revenue forecast with a consensus of how much money there is. And, the context for the budget that was presented earlier this year really was recognizing that our revenue in terms of tax dollars coming in to the state has consistently exceeded projections. So we go into this budget process that was just completed with higher than anticipated revenues. And that was made even more clear when we put out our numbers on Wall Street, which, I'll touch on in a bit. So no surprise, the overall context was not one of short-term weakness as far as state revenue, but in fact, strength. And the governor made a priority in terms of our various proposals to really have an agenda that focused on the challenge of affordability, right? Coming out of COVID, inflation, interest rates, all the various dynamics that have been affecting New Yorkers. So her proposals really tried to touch on how to make it easier for people to live in our state. So when the final budget was completed, and as Ben indicated, we're just going through the details now. We'll have a more specific analysis coming out shortly. You do see a reduction in the personal income tax rates for middle class and low income families, an expansion of the child tax credit, inflation refund checks, a rebate, if you will, again, to try to make it more affordable for people in New York, greater investment in programs that people care about related to housing, and child care services as well were certainly some of the very, very key priorities. As you also know, and I won't get into detail on it, part of or what would probably be considered one of the main reasons why the budget was late is that certain non-fiscal matters were being tied to the budget negotiation. So reforms to discovery laws, involuntary commitment, cell phone ban in schools, and the debate about a ban on masks. So these non-budget issues tended to take a lot of time and distracted from looking at the specific dollars and cents part of the budget process. That's not unusual for Albany. Many decisions are made in the context of budget negotiations. You could debate from a government perspective whether that's good or bad. It is part of the ways of doing things in Albany and has been for a long period of time. As I mentioned, the next step, because in terms of the Controller's Office, we do not have a direct role as far as the budget process. I always have to remind people that we're not the ones that set the funding levels. It's the legislature and the governor are the ones responsible for that. When the budget's done, we will then follow the money, make sure it's spent as intended. And we do have a limited role as far as revenue forecasting, but it really is the responsibility of the Senate, the Assembly, and the governor to come up with the budget. What we will do now, and Maria Doulis, who's here, who heads our budget and policy group, her team is now going through all the detail of the budget. And then we will present a report in terms of what we see. What we really look to particularly, because at the end of the day, it is the responsibility of the legislature to make the decision on where to put the money. And we'll make sure the money's spent as they intended. But what we really try to keep a focus on is the long-term budget balance for the state. So that one of the key pieces of information that's still not out there is what is the impact of the spending plan for the coming year on the out-year picture. We know that from the governor's initial proposal, there were cumulative out-year budget gaps of about $27 billion. So the question really is, will this budget and the spending decisions made this year, what will be the impact as far as those out-year budget gaps? And that's really the concern we always identify from the Controller's Office. It's great to spend the money that you have, and certainly, people want programs that are important to them, but can we afford to pay for it, not just in the coming year, but in the out years? And that's where there's a concern. Now, that concern is more amplified in these uncertain times because of some very clear factors. Number one, where's this economy headed? We know certainly looking at the markets, there's been a tremendous amount of volatility. You saw the GDP was down, for the first time in a long time in the recent quarterly report. You see the economists forecasting probability of a recession. That prediction, those numbers have gone up a little higher, although the economists usually are as accurate as the weather forecasters, right? So you don't really can't put too much stock in that. But let's just say there is uncertainty with this economy. Where is it headed? What will the impact be? Particularly the whole debate on tariffs and where is that heading? So the possibility of people being a bit more conservative, perhaps not spending as much money, since so much of our economic activity is fueled by consumer spending. Certainly, we've seen sales tax revenue be more moderate in terms of growth. We're still growing our sales tax revenue, the second most important revenue source to the state after the personal income tax. But we're starting to see some moderation of revenue coming there. So there's some economic uncertainty, perhaps more than there had been a year or so ago. The bigger question, though, that looms before us is what will be the impact of decisions made in Washington as far as federal funding, and what will the impact be on the state, on the city. And that's where I think it's appropriate to say we have great concern. We have been issuing reports in recent years. I think we've done 9 so far. Some of you remember Senator Moynihan did the periodic reports on the balance of payments. How much money does New York State get back for the tax money we send to Washington, D.C.? And generally speaking, New York has been a donor state. We give more money than we get back. What's interesting is that in recent years, we actually have been receiving more money back from Washington than we send. In our most recent report, which was based on 2023 numbers, for every dollar that was sent to Washington, we got back $1.06. We had projected, going back probably 2-3 years ago, that since much of this change happened because of all the federal money that came in as part of pandemic relief, with COVID, that once that money is spent down, we might see a return to the pre-COVID balance going more, that we send more money to Washington than we get back. The concern now is with some of the cuts being discussed in Washington, will we in fact see an acceleration of that trend to go back to New York being a donor state? Consider that in any given year, the state budget is 35 to 40% based on federal funds. So it's a very significant part of the revenue that comes to the state, particularly with regard to healthcare, social services, education, housing. This is a real concern. So pandemic money is pretty much being spent down. We know what we read in the papers, all this discussion of cutbacks coming out of Washington. How will those changes in formulas affect some of the formula-driven programs? What will happen to important programs like SNAP and Medicaid that people in New York really do depend on, especially vulnerable people? So when you look at some of the changes that are being proposed, as far as Medicaid, particularly community engagement requirements for able-bodied adults on Medicaid, requiring cost sharing for recipients who are above the poverty line, reducing federal matching funds by 10% to states providing health care coverage for undocumented under Medicaid or another state-based program. So particularly if you're in New York City, where a significant part of the population is enrolled in these programs, there could be a very, very direct and very, very harmful impact. What we're doing, again, to try to keep everybody's focus in this area, we're going to be releasing in the next few days an interactive online resource that will detail the federal funding that flows through the state budget. It'll include information on state programs and the employees in the state programs that are supported by federal dollars. And we'll also give county-by-county enrollment in the safety net programs that have traditionally been funded by the federal government. There already have been some impacts in some of the changes as far as policy direction coming out of Washington. As you know, the governor announced that the federal government has cut $1.3 billion in funding to New York. That includes over $360 million in federally funded health programs for addiction services and mental health support. $100 million for education provided through the pandemic has been clawed back as well. Now, what's happened with some of these announcements as far as cutbacks is that there's often a reversal, there's a pause, there's a lawsuit. The courts are wading through all of this. So some of this is still very much uncertain, unclear as to what's going to happen. And then, of course, you saw the president had an executive order freezing the payments from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a concern in terms of expectation that New York had, both the state and local governments, in terms of investments that would come from these programs. Just from the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, $13.6 billion is what we were expecting. So, we have to keep a close eye on what's happening with this. It's going to mean, though, that there's going to be a fair amount of uncertainty attached to the implementation of the spending priorities that the legislature and the governor have put forth in the recently adopted budget. how do you prepare for something like that? Well, one of the concerns that we identified as the process was unfolding is, are there going to be any contingencies built into this budget for possible federal cutbacks? I know that's a tough question to answer because if you don't know what the magnitude, or if you can't quantify what the cutback is, how can you put a contingency in place? But it's why over the years we have said, and I give credit to the governor and legislature for building up our reserve funds to a higher level than we've had in New York for many, many years, and they deserve a credit for that. In fact, the statutory reserve funds are up to over $8 billion at this point, highest level for many, many years. But those reserves really should be for a true fiscal emergency, an economic meltdown like we had when the Great Recession hit a dozen or so years ago, like we had with the COVID close down, not really set up to deal with a restructuring of the federal and state relationship. There are other reserve funds, call them informal reserves, not the statutory reserves, which frankly I prefer because they're more protected as to when you could use them. So we've had reserves at about $21 billion in recent years when you add in those informal reserve funds, kind of as a buffer or cushion for economic uncertainties. It does appear, and this was a good policy decision, again, an issue that we had identified a couple of years ago. New York State was one of the few states that had a significant remaining debt owed to the federal government for the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. Many other states used COVID relief money to pay off that debt. New York was not one of those states. That creates a burden on the businesses that have to pay that. It also limits the opportunity to enhance those benefits, and those benefits have been lagging in terms of meeting the need. So this budget does include a paying down of that federal debt. But it appears, and again, we're looking at the fine print, that some of those informal reserves were used to pay that down, again, reducing one of the buffers that could have been there, depending on what we may face as far as federal cutbacks. The legislature, as part of the budget, though, did agree to giving the governor the authorization to cut or eliminate funding for up to $2 billion worth of programs, depending on what would happen with the federal government. They could overrule that if they have their own plan. And the bottom line, though, for the state is that as generous as this budget is, it is possible, depending on how severe cuts may be coming out of Washington. Everybody assumes there'll be some level of cuts. I'm hoping it'll be moderated because of the politics and certainly for the House politically, it's a very slim majority, and if they go too far, they'll lose that majority. So I'm hopeful that it won't be as severe as perhaps we think it could be. But the bottom line is this: you could see a situation, I'm not predicting it, where the legislature will have to come back in the fall and deal with perhaps having to eliminate some of the funding that has just been agreed to. Just something to be aware of. How does this all shake out in terms of impact on New York City? Well, New York City also benefited from unexpectedly higher revenues than initially projected, resulting in fewer, or reduction, I should say, in the out-year budget gaps. The city also faces uncertainty with the economy, with federal aid as well. New York City, the administration released its budget for the coming year, $118 billion for fiscal year 2026. It doesn't, from our perspective, address all of the risks that we've identified in the past as far as the city budget. There certainly is an increase in spending. Again, this reflects the fact that revenues have been coming in higher for the city than initially projected. What was good about the proposal is that some of the spending cliffs that we've identified in analysis of the city budget, and I should mention we have, as part of the state controller's operation, an office for New York City. It comes out of the New York City fiscal crisis. We have a team that's led by Rahul Jain, who's here as well. That is the entity that looks at New York City finances, New York City budget, MTA as well, and I'll touch on MTA in a moment. So what was good about this budget is that some of the fiscal cliffs that we identified earlier, they did come up with funding, particularly with regard to the Department of Education, Department of Aging, CUNY, and some other areas. But even with those additions, there are some risks that we think have not been fully accounted for. So as the city has raised its revenue forecast, it's also raised its spending. And so that's where, again, out-year budget gaps for the city also are a problem and an issue that we need to see how it's going to be addressed. We'll see how the city council will manage this as they finalize the city budget for the coming year. New York City particularly, I think, in terms of the economy, has to be concerned about the impact that's happening on the national level, the debate about tariffs. What will that mean in terms of our import-export relationships? We issued a report on imports and exports for New York City, showed that in 2023, the New York City metropolitan area accounted for $103 billion, 69% of New York State imports. And the New York City metro area is the second largest exporter in our country. So while we don't know where this whole tariff debate is going, the reality is it could have a significant impact on our revenue picture, certainly for the city. And again, besides the macroeconomic challenges that are out there, the city obviously has also a dependence on federal programs as well. We did an analysis just about a week or so ago that looked at the various city programs that are funded with federal dollars. And our concern is that we approximate about $535 million in federal aid over the next 2 years could be in jeopardy. Keep in mind that about $7.4 billion, or a little over 6% of total spending in the city's operating budget, comes from federal aid. But it's important to point out that these funds cover a very significant percentage of essential services related to education, social services, and housing. Outside of the city's budget, federal funds also provide direct aid to agencies or entities that are semi-autonomous, not directly like a city agency, NYCHA, CUNY, Health and Hospitals, the MTA as well. So we see risks. We see average budget gaps, about $5.4 billion over the next few years. We'll again keep an eye as the city budget process is finalized. And again, our view will be what is going to be the long-term perspective for budget balance for New York City. New York City, I have to point out, as opposed to the state, in recent years has not done very much to increase its rainy day reserve funds. So that kind of cushion that we always think makes more sense, the city has left itself more open by not building up those reserves in the past. MTA has been very much top of mind for everyone in the downstate region, certainly a very, very important part of government service that's provided, very, very key to our economy. So let me just give you a quick update as far as MTA. That was very much a part of the state budget process. Bottom line, the MTA operating budget, which now totals close to $20 billion, faces a deficit of $260 million, a manageable deficit. There are, again, out-year budget gaps that grow that have to be mindful of. The MTA does expect to close this gap this year with fare and toll hikes and some FEMA COVID reimbursement that has been pending. The other factor that is somewhat tied to meeting that gap closing is the $1.5 billion expected to be received from the casinos. We'll see when the casinos actually, when that process finalizes, but MTA funding is part of what's tied to that as well. The state budget assumes that the MTA will save hundreds of millions of dollars in planned savings. So it's very important for MTA leadership to execute and follow through on those savings plans if it wants to prevent those budget gaps from going and, in fact, getting them to be eliminated. So much of the MTA's finances, though, depend on ridership returning. We are not back to pre-pandemic levels in terms of ridership. The numbers are obviously better, and they have been getting better, but the MTA, more than other public transit systems in the nation, really does depend on what's coming in at the fare box. So focusing on issues like safety, like the frequency and reliability of service, keeping the system in a state of good repair, that's very important to get ridership back to the subways, the trains, and the buses. And that's where the capital plan discussion comes in. The MTA's capital plan, has been much debated. The MTA had a $48 to $50 billion hole across the 2020-24 and 2025-29 capital plans as we started this year. The 2020 to 2024 capital plan had a $15 billion funding risk from the congestion pricing debate. Now, congestion pricing is here. You know, the federal government has a different opinion. So again, some of this still remains to be seen how the courts will play all of this out. But congestion pricing from a revenue perspective has been bringing in money higher than initially projected, collected in the first 3 months, $150 million. So certainly the projection to achieve a number of $500 million annually, they are on track for that. You know, people asked me when the debate was going on, did I favor congestion pricing or not favor it? I said, I had no opinion whether it's good or bad. The issue is the MTA's capital plan depended on this funding. If you don't want congestion pricing, come up with another $15 billion through another source. Nobody came up with that, so congestion pricing is here for now. We'll see how the give and take will be with the federal government on this. But looking ahead for the 2025-2029 capital plan, it totals over $68 billion. As you know, there was some back and forth with the Capital Program Review Board. One would assume now that the state budget is done that approval, in fact, will come. The MTA identified about $34 billion of funding, but had a $33 billion funding gap on that plan. The state budget now will fully fund the plan by increasing the payroll mobility tax. This will affect mostly the larger employers in the MTA region. There's been some reconfiguration of which employers pay how much on that. Reallocating $1.2 billion in funds from Penn State Reconstruction Project, and with the MTA capital plan identifying their own savings and operating savings that could generate another $3 billion from the agency itself. So this clearly represents a significant investment from the state, represents at least for now, agreement on where the MTA's capital funding is going to come from. The capital plan does depend on $14 billion in federal resources. Again, let's see whether or not that will be affected by decisions being made in Washington. We'll continue to track what's happening with the MTA as far as their finances as well, because it is so critical to our economy. So I know I threw a lot at you in terms of numbers and facts and figures, but you know, I would say the bottom line is this. Right now, the state and the city are in a stronger fiscal and budget position than we've been in a long time. The concern that I would identify, though, is not just looking at where we're at today as far as our finances and our budget, but where will we be a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now? And that's the, you know, really the concern. There was nothing, for instance, in the state budget that really spoke to the need, particularly with the Medicaid program, which is often debated about why is it growing so much and what can we do to contain costs without hurting people's services. There was really no effort to really address that as a concern. And so if we come up to a point where the federal government does a significant reduction in money coming to us for Medicaid, how are we going to deal with that? Will we have the resources to backstop that money at the state level? Again, depending on how severe the cuts would be, maybe we will, maybe we won't. Will we have to then, as I said earlier, come back and do some retrenchment on some of the program commitments that are being made now? The difficulty there is obviously for our local governments, including New York City and local governments across the state, for our nonprofits, our social service entities, the other agencies that depend on state funding. They base their budgets on what they're being told at this time of year from the state. There's nothing worse, and we've had this in some years in the past when we faced challenges where mid-year local government, a social service agency, has to face a cutback that hadn't been planned for in their own budget building process. So I think there's some vulnerability out there we have to be mindful of. I'm not predicting the worst outcome in terms of Washington, but I am concerned that we could have done a bit more to do preparation with a bit more planning, a bit more focus on, this is part of what we do. And I'm not going to get into all the audits, but Ben mentioned it. Just on the Medicaid program alone, we consistently find opportunities for significant savings to happen without hurting people who depend on the service. Deal with issues of inefficiency and waste that are there. And we don't have the ability with our audits to compel implementation of our recommendations. But my point is that there are ways, if you focus on it, in fact, to achieve savings, to ensure greater viability long-term and security for these programs. And we shouldn't be afraid to say, all right, these programs are important. They're important to people, but are we spending the money as smartly and as wisely as we can, especially with the backdrop of having to anticipate that we will not be treated so favorably by Washington. So a lot for us all to look at in terms of where we're headed for the city and for the state. I feel good about where we're at today. I'm always the optimist. I wouldn't stay in government if I wasn't an optimist, but I think the landscape is very problematic, both with the economy and certainly with the federal-state relationship and the federal-city relationship with where we stand right now in 2025. So thank you for your kind attention. Open for questions. Oh, sure.
We've got two mics if you want to come over to this one or two people. We'll get started here. We have a bunch of people interested in asking questions, which is great. Just a reminder, please no speeches, just a quick question so we can get to everybody who's up for the controller. All right, back to you.
Michelle Winfield.
Hello.
Michelle Winfield.
Go back and forth.
Very short. Jewish private school children, don't they deserve an education? That's a question.
So the question was Jewish private school students, don't they deserve an education? I think the question is behind the change that was included in the budget. You know, that was an educational policy question, not something that we weighed in on. So not everybody's happy with that change. Some people are. We'll have to see how it will be implemented. But obviously, every student should have a good education. Yeah.
Hello. We need to talk about the $9 billion contract with PPL, the contract that
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
the $9 billion contract with PPL for the CityPAP services,
Uh-huh.
the contract that you've never seen. I'm a caregiver for my mother through CityPAP. PPL is not paying me or the other personal assistants. There are thousands of workers that aren't being paid accurately, on time, or at all. There is no oversight. Do you see that as a problem?
The short answer is yes. As you know, and I think you stated in your question, we were cut out of that process. Normally, a contract like that would be reviewed by the State Comptroller's office. You know, this is a trend that it didn't begin, but certainly was accelerated during COVID, where our oversight has been written out statutorily. So this was an example where that specific item we were exempted from review. You know, how we would have evaluated that contract had it come before us, I can't answer because it didn't happen. But this is obviously a matter, you know, for the legislature and the governor to consider. I'm not aware they did any changes in this budget. I know there's been an extension in terms of the implementation. Again, you know, the limitation, for better or for worse, of ours, we have no direct role in the administration.
Can you
of that program.
demand to see the contract? The public wants to see the
We were cut out of it specifically.
How do you pay the bills with never seeing the contract? Your office,
We were
your office has
statutorily.
said you will never see the contract.
we
and
were
you're spending $9 billion of our money.
The legislature and the governor wrote us out of it.
They wrote you out of the contracting
Yeah.
part, not the overseeing part.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a problem that needs to be solved because CDPAP
You're
is being
speaking out of turn,
dismembered.
ma'am. There's a line here
I
on both
understand,
sides.
and this is 700,000 people.
Sit down.
Fair.
I'm Michael Myers, I'm president of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. My question is it's about oversight of the MTA. What the heck is going on with oversight in terms of the elevators don't work, the escalators don't work? These have negative impacts on senior citizens in particular. And the trains are always hot in the summertime and always cold in the wintertime. Is that any part of your job in terms of monitoring and making sure that the MTA is responsible and accountable to the people?
Yes. And you should go to our website because we do regular audits of the MTA, including on many of the issues that you identified. Keep in mind, the MTA is governed by a board. That's the first level of oversight. The MTA is subject to legislative oversight in terms of legislative hearing process as well. The MTA has an inspector general, and the MTA is subject to audit by our office. You know, we have responsibility for auditing all local governments, all state agencies, public authorities, including the MTA. So we cannot be full-time auditors of the MTA. But the issues you've identified are ones that are definitely on our list. You know, the MTA audits that we do, most recent one was on procurement and recommending ways they could be more efficient, how they're spending money. Similar to the other audits that we do, we can audit and we could find a shortcoming, and we certainly have focused on issues of accessibility, as you mentioned. We can't force the MTA to implement anything we recommend. But absolutely, look at our website. If you want to leave your name and number with Rahul, I'll volunteer you. We could pass any specific recommendation on an area you think we haven't looked at closely enough, and certainly have our audit folks take a look and be in touch with you.
Hi, Mr. Napoli. How you
Hi.
doing? I've actually been to Padua, Italy. You are an honorary citizen.
Ah,
Thank you.
thank you.
You and I.
Not many people have been there.
No, I have. In fact, I went there, somebody told me that. Sorry. Someone in my office asked me to ask this question. She's handicapped. You and I both went to Hofstra. When my pro football career came to an end, I stayed on Long Island, went to law school. I was surprised to find out how Hofstra had implemented the Vocational Rehabilitation Act way ahead of any federal mandate. Hofstra, if anybody doesn't know, elevators, ramps, is a school that, coming from Baltimore, I was shocked to see Holland had absolutely gone ahead of the federal government mandate and made it accessible. A woman who works for me is a quadriplegic. And she has told me that riding the subways is a disaster, and she gets the impression that your audits don't address that part of the MTA deficiency. Because the MTA has actually been out of compliance with that same act, Vocational Rehabilitation Act, that Hofstra went way ahead and complied with.
Well-
You and I both worked at the state legislative staff at the same time.
Uh-huh.
Mr. Margiotta had invited me to change parties, which
Sure.
I didn't do.
Sure.
Thank you.
We have a lot of overlap there. And Hofstra, when I went there in the 70s, was way ahead of any other institution as far as handicap accessibility. No, but our audits have looked at that question, and our reports on the MTA have specifically spoken to the fact that the MTA has been behind as far as elevators and ADA accessibility. But this is why it was important for the capital plan to be fully funded, because besides keeping the system in a state of good repair, they will be able to follow through on their schedule to implement those accessibility issues that have not been fully addressed. So what, our goal will be, and I think the others that provide oversight in the MTA will be to make sure the MTA follows through on these plans. They do have the plans to address this. They now have the capital money. It's up to the MTA now to execute, and we'll keep an eye on that.
Tommy Dean, in addition to the MTA, which stands for money thrown away, do you think it's possible you could audit the Labor Department, or I should say Slavery Department? Do you think it's possible you could audit the State Social Department, which is actually a temporary and disability assistance office?
Which office?
The New York State Social Department, which is actually a temporary and disability assistance office, OTDA.
Social
Yes, they-
services, yeah.
But both of them railroaded me in the past. I'll
Yeah.
give you details.
Yeah. We've done OTDA audits. Again, we could get back to you as far as the specifics on which ones we've done recently, but we have been looking at that agency as well. Yes.
Thank you, Tommy Dean.
Thank you.
Every year, when the state completes its budget plan, the general public believes that the state is in financial balance. But the final numbers don't reflect the amount of deferred capital expenditures that should have been spent on infrastructure to keep up with normal wear and tear. So my question is, would it be helpful if the budget process was required to give an estimate as to how much should have been spent on capital if the state was going to keep its capital facilities in a good state of repair? I believe that this would help the public understand whether things are really in balance or not, or whether we're basically kicking a lot of cans down the road.
Yeah. A number of years ago, we proposed a new structure for capital planning in the state to have I forgot the full label that we gave the entity, but it would be basically a capital planning super body to really do an inventory of capital needs, certainly starting with state structures, but also the capital needs at the local government level, so that when capital funding is identified, it's tied to some priority list. I think one of the concerns I've had over the years, is that when certain capital initiatives are undertaken, they're not necessarily tied to a comprehensive plan and a real set of priorities. So I do think greater accounting for and transparency on our capital assets, what state of repair are they in, what is our schedule for maintenance, absolutely would be an improvement to how we're doing things now.
Thank you.
I'm going to take one final moment of privilege to ask one question of you. We continue to see late state budgets, as we've discussed. Under Governor Cuomo, there was a real effort to have on-time budgets, but those were very often then even more shrouded in sort of uncertainty and secrecy and so forth, and jammed through in the middle of the night. I asked you this, I think, a few years ago on the podcast, but I'm curious about now that you've seen a new administration and these deliberations continue to go into May. Do you have any thoughts about shifting the state fiscal year at all? Should that, and especially when you think about tax deadlines and things like that, it always occurs to me that it's a very short window for Albany to come back into session and have a budget passed by April 1st. Any thoughts on shifting the state fiscal year even a month or anything along those?
Yeah, no, it absolutely would make sense, right? So tax collections are done by April 15th. You're supposed to have a budget due by April 1st. So it's out of sync. You know, we're the only state with that kind of a fiscal year. So I've always felt, even when I was in the legislature, you know, a June 1st or a July 1st deadline made more sense. Obviously, if you do that, you know, you have to figure out the transition, you know, so for the first year or so, probably be some complication in how to do that. But I think moving the state fiscal year would be helpful. I don't know that that would totally remedy the challenge. You know, in a year like this, you know, there was enough money, right? The problem wasn't that there wasn't money. You know, in some of the years where it looks like we're short, you want to wait till a later date because then you see what the real numbers are and you're hoping there'll be an upside to it. What I would like to see, there was one of the years when I was in the legislature where there was actually a I won't say fully functioning, but I'll say a somewhat functioning conference committee process, where you had members of the legislature, and back when I was there, the Senate was Republican, the Assembly was Democrat, but you had majority and minority rank and file legislators sitting in conference committees, debating what the priorities should be. You had they called it the mothership that would identify spending targets, and then each conference committee would come up with recommendations. Was it a completely open process? No, but it was more open than the process we have now. So the conference committees would meet publicly, so the press and the public could hear what the debate was, see what the options were. And it really engaged rank and file members more directly than we've seen. We certainly have gone back, you're absolutely right, to a process that even sometimes when you talk to legislators, they're not sure what's going on. And that's obviously not the best process. So I think if we would change the fiscal year, I think a more logical calendar would make sense. But also getting back to trying to resurrect some version of that conference committee process where rank and file members are fully engaged, that would make sense. And look, others have said, and there's not some, there's certainly a kernel of truth in this, that in a year like this, and we've seen other years like this, where the big holdups are on non-budget issues, you know, you wonder how much time is really being spent on the budget when the debate is on these non-budget issues that's taking everybody's, you know, psychic energy and time. So you know, because what you're going to have now is the budget's done, it's done late, and before you know it, we'll be looking at the June deadline for session. I think they're going to extend it by a couple of days. I think the speaker had indicated. But the non-budget issues are going to be dealt with in a very, very truncated time frame. And I'm sure what'll happen with some of those issues, including some of the ones that some folks have raised here, it'll get, you know, you get to the second week of June because, well, we're running out of time. It's the end of session. Can't deal with it. We'll take it up again next year. So that's, I think, partially why you end up with so much getting put of policy into the budget, is that it's almost like the budget process becomes the key part of the legislative year. It's a little different than it was years ago. But I think a reform by starting with change of the fiscal year be a great place to start. I don't think it would solve all of it, Ben, but I think it would be an intelligent first step.
State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli.
Thank you.
Thank you, Comptroller, very much. This was a great program. Thank you all for being here. Please join us again at our upcoming programs, May 29th, June 3rd, June 17th. RSVP and join us again, please. Thank you.